So help me God. So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to So Help Me Pod, a podcast about the theologies and faiths of the American presidency. My name is Rob Lee. I'm a doctoral candidate at the Pacific School of Religion. As always, I'm joined by my younger and less interesting brother, Scott Lee. Welcome to the podcast. Today, we're going to talk about President Andrew Jackson, our nation's seventh president. He lived from 1767 to 1845. He was the seventh president of the United States who served from 1829 to 1837. He was Presbyterian, but we'll get to that. So obviously, this is a more difficult and more weighty topic than some of the topics we've discussed in previous episodes. Kind of our intro and guiding question is, what might it be like if someone attempted to murder you and your entire family by forcibly relocating you from everything you held dear in the dismal conditions while failing to compensate for that atrocity? Then what might it be like for your nation to that you reside in to be so enamored with the perpetrator of this harm that they had his face emblazoned on currency that was exchanged daily between persons in the United States? Well, you don't have to wonder too hard, because that is what indigenous persons in this country have experienced their entire lives with the nation's seventh president of the United States on the $20 bill. In fact, today, many Native Americans refuse to utilize or use the $20 bill because President Jackson's face is on it. President Jackson has darkened the $20 bill since 1928. His populist policies, appeasement, and handling of the Native Americans made him a complicating and damning figure on the landscape of the American presidency. Even still, he maintains popularity as a president, which just tells you a lot about our nation and where we stand. Interestingly, though, Scott, Andrew Jackson was born in the colonial Carolinas before the American Revolution. He was, we're starting to get to the point where presidents would have been born after the American Revolution, but Andrew Jackson was one who was born in what would have been North Carolina around that time. Some say South Carolina. There's some debate about that. Jackson was well off in his life, and that aristocratic lifestyle led him into slaveholding. By his death in 1845, he had in his possession over 150 enslaved persons. It made him one of the more robust slaveholding presidents of the age. Andrew Jackson became a national war hero, commanding an army as general in the War of 1812 after his victory in the Battle of New Orleans. This success earned him the Congressional Gold Medal and thanks from Congress, and set him on a trajectory towards the White House. Scott, if you go to New Orleans today, you will see that there is a statue that still stands of General Jackson prominently there in the city. Jackson set his sights on a populist response to a more post-federalist policies of the Quincy Adams administration in his run for president in the 1820s. Populism is a political strategy, so you kind of want to know what populism is. It's a political strategy by which the candidate seeks to address the needs of ordinary people and making sure that they feel heard in the political process. And this is often held in contrast with big government or big government bureaucracy and big spending on government programs. Interestingly enough, most of our populist presidents, however, have been really wealthy. Like they're not popular in the sense of being normal human beings. They're quite wealthy. One of the more recent presidents to engage in populism would have been our immediately past president, President Donald Trump. There was significant palace intrigue during the first Jacksonian term and the Jacksonian administration. the Petticoat Affair, in which the Secretary of War, John Henry Eaton's wife, Margaret, was accused of adultery. This harkened back for Andrew Jackson to his life when his late wife, Rachel, and the president were accused of adultery because of a divorce, and they didn't know if the divorce was finalized, but they lived together. I mean, Scott, think of how tame a reality that is compared to our scandals now. Like, I mean, that almost seems like normal, that would be like, oh, that's just a passing news story, right? That someone lived together after a divorce. President Jackson used the power of the federal government and the United States military to enact the Indian Removal Act, in which Native Americans were either poorly negotiated or forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands and set to newly established Indian tribal territories. Interestingly enough, because the office of the presidency was still relatively compressed, and Jackson was attempting to compress it even more because he wanted small government, he engaged in this negotiations head on. He was a key negotiator in the Indian Removal Act. For some Native persons, this became known as the Trail of Tears, which we in this area, Scott, with the Cherokee Indian tribe and other Indian tribes in our area, know a lot about in terms of history and perspective. The reality of this painful period in our nation's history would have lasting ramifications that are still felt to this day, with Indigenous persons and Native persons feeling the effects of their removal from their ancestral homelands. Despite his despicable and condemnable actions, both on stage and behind the scenes with Native Americans, he heartily won re-election. He received 55% of the popular vote and 219 electoral votes in the election of 1832. A subsequent victory for this president, or really a substantial victory for this president. However, that said, by the time that he was starting his second term, slavery was already becoming the polarizing hot button issue of the day, even with the atrocity of the Indian Removal Act. President Jackson believed wholeheartedly that this was a states' rights issue, most likely due to his slaveholding proclivities. It would be interesting because President Jackson appointed Chief Justice Roger Taney to the High Court. You may have actually heard that about the Taney Court, a justice who would become synonymous with the Dred Scott versus Sanford case. This case established that the United States Constitution did not extend citizenship and rights therein to people of Black descent. Later, Chief Justices of the United States would call this the greatest self-inflicted wound in the United States Supreme Court history. President Jackson was the first president to fall victim to an assassination attempt, along with being the first president to be physically assaulted for his administration's policies. In 1833, he was struck because he had dismissed a naval officer for embezzlement of government funding. In 1835, a misfired pistol is the only thing that stood between the seventh president of the United States and certain assassination and death. As I mentioned, there are plenty of memorials, including that of President Jackson being on the $20 bill to the seventh president, despite his legacy of supporting the Indian Removal Act and enslavement of Black persons. It shows you how complicated memory can be and how things can look differently to different people, and how there can be significant disagreement on how we should remember history. President Andrew Jackson, what does this mean about his faith and public life? He was deeply committed to religious pluralism, meaning that he believed that there was space for everyone, ironically, in the White House, if you were white and a man, essentially, kind of thing. But still, he believed in religious pluralism, that people of religious perspectives should be offered and afforded the same rights as each. He elected not to, as had been a tradition, declare a national day of prayer for the United States during his 8 years in office. That said, the president was not without religiosity or some sense of theological moorings. He had a significant religious conversion experience, is what they would call it, upon leaving the White House in 1838. He would later join the First Presbyterian Church in Nashville, Tennessee. where he remained a member for the rest of his life. Though he was Presbyterian, it was generally accepted that he rejected Calvinism, which is more of a tenet of the Presbyterian Church, or kind of mainline Presbyterianism, which believed in the idea of predestination, the idea that you were destined for something by God on the basis of the virtue of common people. He believed this was kind of due to his populist identity, that because of who he was, he could not believe that we were all destined for this, for God's destiny for us, but instead we had free will to make that for ourselves. He firmly believed that God had a hand in military pursuits and was often known to pray during battles he participated in. Again, we talked about this in the last episode, but the Jacksonian era was full of scandal and disagreement in the president's administration. Yet the Second Great Awakening was reaching its crescendo during his time in office. So, Scott, what questions do you have for us? How can we help you better understand President Andrew Jackson?
I feel like a lot of the times when I didn't know a lot about him, but I feel like it was very much a lot of his decisions were based on how many slaves he owned and how much land he could get. So I would like to first ask Calvinism, for those of our viewers or listeners that don't know, what is that?
Calvinism is a theological understanding of the world popularized by its titular head, John Calvin. John Calvin was a person who lived earlier, obviously, than Jackson, and was a theologian. He would go to Geneva, Switzerland, and try to make out kind of this Calvinistic society in which there were understandings in which you were predestined. It was theocratic. There was and that's really where, even though Jackson was Presbyterian, which came out of the Calvinistic understanding of theology, he really differed in a lot of ways with Calvin's identity and beliefs about theocracy, the idea that the government should be of God and not of man. He also differed with Calvin on the identity of predestination, the understanding that God would predestine you either to heaven or to hell, and your life even more predestination might say that God predestines everything that you do. Like the fact that we would be on this podcast at 12:59 on whatever, on October or whatever, that would be because God destined it to be. Now, you and I both grew up United Methodist, and the counter to that would be a Wesleyan or Armenian way of believing, which is in free will, which is the idea, and this is what Jackson kind of held to, was the idea that you establish, with God's help, the way in which you ought to live, the way in which you are called to live, and the way and ultimate destiny of your soul. So that's kind of the Calvinist versus Armenian. And Armenianism is not named after the country, the modern country, but after Jacob Arminius. So just to clarify there.
It was the Presbyterian Church the same that we see today?
I think it's impossible to say that any denomination was the same as it was today, especially prior to the American Civil War. Every denomination that was at a national level would end up having some reckoning with slavery, with enslavement, with the tearing apart of our country. And that said, I think it's impossible to say that they're the same. They certainly became something more beyond what they were then. And that evolution led to the First Presbyterian Church Nashville, where Jackson was a member. Today is part of the Presbyterian Church USA, and the Presbyterian Church USA is a rather progressive mainline denomination in the Christian tradition that believes in things such as the affirmation of gay people in ministry and in church membership. They're somewhat progressive on a lot of issues, and so you see how this evolution from what Jackson might have been comfortable with to today is very important to realize and to recognize. President Andrew Jackson was a president who is complicated But it seems clear that his presidency was one that was full of condemnable actions, especially by today's standards. While it's impossible to compare someone who lived in a time that is not ours, it is important to recognize the ways in which his actions harmed people for generations. And it is a reminder to all of us to make sure that our actions are becoming of not only our generation, but generations to come. Scott, our next episode is going to be really interesting for us, especially with our last name. We're going to be talking about a man who was the former general of the Army of the United States of America, and who would subsequently become the 18th President of the United States of America, President Ulysses S. Grant, who delivered handily a defeat to our ancestor, our collateral ancestor, Robert Edward Lee, in the American Civil War. All that's to say, it's going to be a really interesting episode. We talked about Grant. He's a really interesting guy. Smoked a lot of cigars, drank a lot of alcohol. Just a really got a speeding ticket on a horse in D.C. It was kind of hilarious how that played out. But all that's to say is we will discuss him on the next episode of So Help Me Pod. Find more information on our website. And as always, we're so grateful that you tuned in. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
You've been listening to So Help Me Pod, a podcast of Beloved Journal in conjunction with Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. The podcast is offered in partial completion of the Doctor of Ministry degree for the Reverend Robert W. Lee. All opinions and insights offered are solely owned by that of those who offered them and do not reflect the views of stakeholders in the project. There have been 45 men and 46 presidential administrations, all of them unique. Some of them have been more interesting than others, some of them more terrifying than others. All have been part of the grand expression of democracy on the North American continent and part of the wider conversation of self-governance in the world. These men have failed profoundly, and we have failed profoundly in following their leadership along with our own sometimes antiquated and backwards ways of viewing and acting in the world. That said, this form of leadership is unlike few other, and the greatest gift we have has been given in the ways in which the American experiment continues to prosper despite our terrible misgivings. We are better off because of these men, and we are forever in their debt. For more information, visit www.roblee4.com/presidents.